Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. So a common problem for athletes training on their own is, or in a small group of competitors, is trying to figure out how much strength work and how much conditioning work they should be doing with their extra stuff. There's a huge group of people out there who are training mostly in classes at their CrossFit gym, but sort of have the passion and the desire to do extra stuff, just either for love of being in the gym or in a lot of cases trying to do some competitions at a local scale or potentially at a more competitive scale than that. And most people want to get better across the board at just about everything, right? That it would be nice to have more unbroken chest to bar pull-ups and to have a faster 2K row and to be able to squat 30 pounds more. But the reality is that it's difficult to train all that stuff at once, and we need to sort of have priorities in our training, not just from the perspective of time and energy that we can put into working out in the gym, especially if we're doing mostly classes and trying to tack some stuff on top of that, but also in terms of as an individual, you can only adapt to so much training. And once you start to go past that, you're not helping your cause. So it's really important to understand what you should be working on and how to balance, touching on everything that needs to be touched on for the sport of CrossFit with the idea of actually getting better at the stuff that you want to get better at. So hopefully today we'll be able to frame the discussion of working out what those priorities are and give some tangible recommendations for people to think about how much strength work they should be doing, how much accessory work they should be doing, how much skill work they should be doing, and how much conditioning work they should be doing, especially for folks who are kind of trying to balance all this stuff with class programming that they're doing, let's say 3 to 5 times per week, and they're just throwing in a few additional sessions on top of that. So Luke, I know that you've had some thoughts on prioritization in programming with athletes you've worked with and just stuff you've seen from people kind of trying to do their own stuff at gyms that you've been at. What do you think about that?
So I've worked with a number of people who sort of do this hybrid option where they're doing some of their own individual training and then also trying to mix in some classes. I think the challenge is always that they need or they want to work on certain skills and certain movements or certain capacities. But then as well as that, because they do classes and because that takes up a hefty amount of their overall training volume, they don't actually have control over that. So what I always try to get across to those people is, what's the priority? Is the priority going to be you achieving certain results in your training, or is it going to be sort of remaining part of a community and your training environment? Do you want to be training with certain individuals and having fun more than you want to be getting results? And I think that if those people are training to potentially as a sort of group, there's always usually some form of compromise, or people are literally just jumping in on one person's program or login access to a certain program, and I think that it can get quite confusing as to what you need to be working on. I've generally tried to basically spearhead like the area that they need to work on the most, and then also trying to make sure there's a good balance across the board with all of their movements, because I think that there's a significant amount of improvement that people can make going from like a regular affiliate program, and then all of a sudden making sure that they hit certain movement patterns once a week or once every 2 weeks, when previously they were only doing that maybe once every month, or it was a little bit more sporadic. And I think that there's a certain element of adaptation that can be sort of achieved off of that. But then once they've sort of started to do that, it gets a little bit harder, because then we have to be a little bit more specific as to what they're doing and when they're doing it. But I think that the priorities have to be, or the sort of objectives have to be sort of set. What's more important? Is it going to be working on the skills that you need to be better, or do you want to be having fun in that environment, or do you want to still be just managing a good balance of doing your own thing and then also classes?
I think it's also important to mention that, it's not just about the, let's say, appropriateness of the prescription, like you mentioned, Luke. It's also about what are people going to actually be doing. So I think in a lot of cases, that people who train in these small groups that are kind of cherry picking programs and throwing stuff together are doing that because they know that they have a group that they're accountable to, where it's like, all right, we're going to be at the gym on Saturday from 11 a.m. until 2 p.m. and we're going to do all this stuff. And then if that wasn't sort of like structured in that way, there's no way that they would fit in that much training on their own, given their own sort of schedule. But that having the group there to do it with is a key part of it actually getting done. So there is a bit of a trade-off there in terms of like, okay, well, maybe it's not the perfect prescription, or it kind of doesn't make sense to smash these different programs together, but it may be better to do that than to do nothing, which is kind of the option if it's not structured in that way.
Yeah, like I've had certain people sort of readjust their training week so that they, on the weekends when there's not necessarily as many classes and there's more open gym, they have the ability to do some almost some style of like throwdown workout, but then also have room and space to be working on certain skills beforehand. And I think that it's always a tough one to balance, and I think that people just also have to be fairly realistic in their expectations as well, because they have limited time to train. They have somewhat no control over some of the stuff that they're doing, so they're not necessarily going to be making the improvements as quickly as they see maybe other people doing that have their own individualized program. But then again, obviously their training is set up completely different, and they might be getting a little bit more enjoyment out of their training than the person who's doing their 90 minutes to 2 hours of individualized work and endless intervals in the corner.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think on that point as well, it's people will say stuff like, I love coming with the group because they'll push me. And, from our perspective as coaches, at least I can have sort of like a reaction to that's a little bit negative, where it's like, well, do you really need to be pushed harder? Like, what's going on with that? I don't necessarily think that just trying harder is going to be the recipe for success here, and that a lot of you have no idea how to pace yourselves. So do you really need to get quote unquote pushed in training? What's actually going on? Well, and what I think people actually mean by being pushed in training is that, and this can be a little bit surprising to people who are coaches or maybe have like a serious background in terms of competing in the sport, is that a lot of people, if left to their own devices, will just kind of like shave rounds off of something, or, not really have an idea of their pace and kind of coast through a round and then be like, oh, that was pretty hard. I guess I'll just do 10 power cleans per round instead. And that it's not necessarily that they need to be quote unquote pushed in terms of like trying harder in terms of the intensity that they're putting forth in their conditioning pieces. It's that by having some sort of external accountability, they'll actually just like execute the prescription as it's supposed to be done, as opposed to giving themselves a bunch of outs and ways to sort of like cheat the program, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've actually found that with myself. Like, if I'm not motivated to train and I'm doing a workout that I've just made up for myself, I will give myself those outs and be like, okay, maybe I'll just do 12 minutes instead of 15 minutes. I don't need to go that long. But having that group around you where you're like, okay, I'm actually going to do the full workout, and I can't just bail out of it just because I don't want to do it.
Yeah, like I think there's an element of that, but I also think that people just say stuff like that because they hear other people say it, and they think that that's the right thing to say. So it's like, yeah, I do it because they push me. Whereas, like, I think a lot of people who are involved in CrossFit, they can sort of empathize with it, but they're like, they potentially sort of say goodbye to like one social group, or they don't necessarily socialize with other people because they're on this sort of like health kick, and then all of a sudden the CrossFit has become their new social group, and then that Saturday throwdown or whatever it is then turns into going for like coffee afterwards, and I think that there's a lot more to it than that, and I think that they're sort of I think that's one of the best things about group fitness is that like you turn up, you get it done, and there's sort of like this shared suffering to some degree, and I think that people like it. It seems like an attractive idea to sort of like everyone come together, rally together, write a work up on the whiteboard, which takes up the whole whiteboard, and then just spend like the next 2 hours kicking their own asses, doing some horrible workout.
I think, another layer to that as well is, especially if you have other stuff going on, you're a professional with a job or have a family that you have to drive around and all that kind of stuff, that it can be really difficult to sort of summon the willpower to even train. Right. I know I experienced this just as a business owner where it's, I have more flexibility in my schedule to train kind of, but not in the way that one would think as far as like owning a CrossFit gym. Right. But I know that if I have a morning stuffed with meetings and trying to finish some projects that are behind, and I've spent a huge amount of mental energy over the first, let's say 6 hours of my day. And it's like, theoretically, I'm going to get a quick workout in at 2 p.m. Before the afternoon classes start. A lot of times I just don't want to do it at all. Right? I'm like, I cannot summon the energy to walk downstairs and pull out a barbell and try to do this. And, I'm probably someone who's better than most at just being like, well, I'm going to do it anyway. But that for a lot of people, it's just not going to happen. And that by virtue of having, a group there that is going to work with you, that can really overcome that sort of activation energy of even attempting to do the workout. I know I experienced that as well with like late night soccer games, right? When we have a 10:30 p.m. game, like the last thing I want to do is go play soccer. I'm like, this sounds horrible. But, as soon as you actually show up and your teammates are there and you're like, okay, like something changes in terms of how you're thinking about your own level of just fatigue. And it's just not an issue, right? Then you can't go to sleep afterwards and it messes up your next day. And it's probably not a good thing to be doing in general, but it's when you show up, you're like, okay, cool. I'm ready to kick.
Everything you guys have said about this makes all these groups sound like cults. Like, hey, it's probably not good for you. We're going to do it anyway. It's going to be fun. We're going to trash ourselves.
I just
supports the idea of CrossFit being a cult. So,
I just started doing jiu-jitsu recently, so sometimes at 8 p.m. I'm still doing the class, and then I'm like thinking to myself, I'm literally fighting and rolling around with people, and then I'm going to try and go to bed in 2 hours. It's not going to happen. It's just like so jacked up. But yeah, I think that let's figure out how we can create some takeaways for this cult of people who like to have shared suffering. Something that I have done with like a group in an affiliate I used to work at who were sort of quote unquote more competitive, is I would just create, say, 3 extra pieces that they could do during the week, and one of them would be more capacity based, be working sort of more energy systems. One would be more skill based, with some element of gymnastics strength in there as well potentially, and then one of them would be more strength based. And on the weekend they would do like a 90-minute training session, which was pretty tough. But luckily I was programming the gym as well, so I could make sure that, okay, if they're going to be squatting in the classes, then we're going to be working on that they're going to be pulling from the floor in their sort of like main strength piece. And then I was able to construct it so there was a sort of a fair whack of all movements over the course of, say, 2 weeks. But I think that if say, for instance, you are trying to plug and play some form of accessory work, I think that you probably have to have a good look at what you can do in classes and sort of the movements that you might struggle at. And then also with that, just sort of be careful with not just overloading it with even more. So if you struggle with handstand push-ups and it's not because you're weak in your body or you don't have necessarily the skills, but it's because you find it really difficult to maintain that position. It might be that your additional skill work is actually working on movement work, going through mobility drills, going through movement drills, kicking it up into a handstand, trying to hold better positioning, things like that. So I think that you have to be somewhat aware of like what you need to work on, and then try to formulate the work so that it's challenging the different elements, and it's not just the sort of like reductionist thinking of I'm crap at handstand push-ups, I'm going to do 30 this week and then 40 the next week and then 50 the next week, because that could lead you down to potentially making more compensations.
Yeah, Luke, I like what you said about just having different priorities on different days of accessory work or additional work, right? And a lot of the folks who I think we're speaking to in this episode, we've mentioned that they're already doing a sort of standard CrossFit program in their normal affiliate classes, right? So they're already doing probably 3 to 5 days per week of CrossFit, probably mostly conditioning based with some strength work. So they're getting a lot of touches on a lot of stuff. And then they're typically trying to add in, let's say, maybe 2 or 3 simple accessory sessions before or after class, whether that's some squatting or some monostructural intervals on an assault bike or a rower. And then typically on the weekends, they're kind of having a big throwdown, right? Where they all get together and get after it. And so thinking about, okay, what are your actual priorities that you want to work on for, let's call it 4 accessory sessions per week, right? Let's say that you're doing 2 during the week before or after class that are shorter, and then you're doing 2 longer additional work sessions on the weekends, right? And like you said, Luke, you can easily template that out and say, all right, well, here's what you're going to work on. But sort of the initial question that we were kind of trying to touch on here is, well, how much strength work should you do? How much conditioning work should you do? And how much skill work should you do? So what do you guys think about balancing, let's say, those 3 big picture domains across 4 additional sessions in a week on top of a CrossFit program?
I think part of it comes down to what your CrossFit program, if you're doing a group class, what that is based around. So if your classes are focused on a strength heavy bias in your training cycle, you've got to be careful on how much additional strength work you're adding in. It's something we've just started at my gym with our group classes. We now have an additional piece a day, which is just an optional accessory piece. Very similar to what you were saying, Luke, there, in that one day is a longer aerobic piece, one day is upper body strength biased, one is lower body strength, and one is gymnastic skill, with the idea that those that want additional work can do additional work. But that's very much built around our class program, and it's built to complement that. So I think people have to be careful in terms of the amount of volume or the type of movements they're doing that they add in. If your group class is on a upper body strength bias, well, maybe you don't want to add in too much additional work in upper body strength, and you have to counter that with working on another area that you need to focus on, whether that's your aerobic work, whatever it is.
I think it always depends, obviously, on sort of what the work is you're doing in the classes or with the affiliate programming. I think affiliate program is I think it has improved quite a bit from where it was years ago. So I think that you're probably going to get a little bit more balance in terms of sort of strength work, hitting different movement patterns, and then also different styles of training. I think if you've got 4 sessions in the week, then you could potentially frame 2 of those as being more quote unquote intense. And what I mean by that is you're probably doing a little bit more strength work through that. That's where you're going to be loading up your body. If you sort of like think of it in a very traditional powerlifting, weightlifting, that's going to be sort of like your high tonnage sessions. And then you could have 2 sessions that are lower intensity, but would be working things that are going to be more skill based, or you might be working more cyclical aerobic work. And I think that it's important to also understand that, throughout your training week, you need to create some level of balance. Most people are working 3 days on, 1 day off, and then 2 days on. Or, some people do sort of like a 2 on, 1 off, 2 on. And then if they can get in on the weekend, then they do that. What I like to do is sort of make sure that the training stress is mainly consolidated onto like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then if, say, for instance, the sort of Tuesday is going to be more like an auxiliary day, and then Saturday they can sort of jump in to do what they need to especially if they're doing some level of quote unquote CrossFit and they're trying to practice their sport. Sometimes it can be useful to do that after a training week because you're going to have some level of fatigue that's sort of set in. But as well as that, you have to understand that doing a really hard conditioning session and then doing strength work off the back of that may lead to unproductive work. So how you structure it, you have to make sure that your training is complementing it. So if you're doing your accessory work after class, don't do heavy work. Do some accessory work in the form of traditional weight training, some skill stuff. Don't do things that are very complex that take a lot of your attention if you've just finished some level of some form of conditioning. So I think it depends. If you do your accessory work before a class, you probably have a little bit more leeway in how you do that. But at the same time, if you're going to be snatching and then going into some typical 21-15-9 couplet or triplet at the end of the class or in the class, it's probably best not to accumulate an hour's worth of intervals beforehand. So I think that you have to understand a couple of things like that and make sure that you're structuring your training week so that you have days which are higher stress and then you have days which are lower stress. And then just as well as that, be flexible. And if you do have, say, for instance, 4 days a week, best case scenario, make sure you have, say, 2 of them that are primary ones so that you know that if you have a reduced ability to train because of your schedule, you can then make sure that you're hitting the areas that you need to. I think a lot of people do tend to think of, okay, I'm going to do extra work, I'm just going to get stronger. It does take time to do that, and it's not necessarily going to be happening over the course of a couple of months. And I think that, it's just being understanding of that, and then making sure that you're prioritizing those areas, because you still need to do everything. You still need to play your sport, quote unquote, but you also need to make sure that you're spearheading those areas that need to get worked on the most.
Yeah, I think that the idea of prioritizing, which we talked about, is really important. And then thinking through how you're going to allocate time in those training sessions, and not just time, but also just adaptation currency, right? Like how much can you adapt to training appropriately based upon those priorities? So I think there's sort of an understanding within the CrossFit community that the old school models of block periodization aren't necessarily the best. And by block periodization, we mean, stripping out most things from training and saying, all right, we're going to focus on building strength. Great, we got to this level of strength. Now we're going to focus on building speed. So dropping out most of the strength work and trying to translate that into speed. And then saying, great, we managed to generate some speed. So now we're going to try to generate power. So we're going to switch more from speed work into power work. So we're going to drop the speed work and then add in power work, right? And just having these very focused blocks of training doesn't necessarily result in a robust adaptation for people, that they can get quite a bit better at the specific thing that they're focusing on, but it doesn't integrate into the whole of what they're actually trying to achieve as an athlete. So there's a general understanding, I think, that doesn't work that well. And on the flip side of that, there's this, okay, I need to do everything all the time, right? I need to do handstand push-ups every week, and I need to do muscle-ups every week, and I need to do rowing intervals every week, and I need to do squatting every week. And that can also result in these very messy programs that just kind of have randomness and chaos everywhere. And it just, turns into a shit show, especially for someone who doesn't have the massive abundance of adaptation currency that elite athletes have, and also is trying to sort of piece stuff together with a class program and some accessory work that they're doing, right? So those are kind of like the two extremes that tend to not go so well for people. And like most things, figuring this out properly is difficult to find the balance in between the two extremes. So really what people are going to have to think about is, how do I allocate my time and my adaptation currency appropriately to these 4 sessions that I'm going to be potentially doing on top of my classwork? And based upon that, right, what am I actually prioritizing in terms of, I'm going to get better at this? Like, I am going to improve my squat, or I'm going to improve my muscle ups, or I'm going to improve my actual cyclical conditioning, or I'm just going to get better at CrossFit, right? Like, I want to do better on this type of open workout. And, picking a specific priority, but then turning everything else into maintenance work. So it doesn't mean that just because you are focusing on building cyclical aerobic capacity that you're not squatting. It just means that you're spending more time in adaptation currency on cyclical aerobic work, and that your squatting goes on maintenance, right? So it's this sort of like, if you think about a mixing board where you have like the levels for different frequencies, like moving up and down, right? You can only have the levels high on certain things at a time. And so it's really understanding how much time and how much intensity and difficulty do you want to allocate to different things in those sessions in order to find what is going to be the right balance for you. And that's difficult to do. That's very difficult to do. It's a messy process. No one really knows what's going on. But I do think that that's probably the primary way that people should be thinking about what they're going to actually do for strength work or conditioning work or skill work in their additional sessions.
Yeah, I think one important thing to sort of bear in mind as well is I think that when you have people who are trying to do extra work, it's obvious that they're motivated and they probably want. What I've always seen is they probably overshoot what they are actually able to do. So they'll always give themselves more work than they actually need, or they'll actually just give themselves more work than they can actually complete. But I think that it's important that an athlete, regardless of like the level that they're at, it's always their responsibility to be making sure that they're taking care of like the lowest hanging fruit in what they need. So they're doing the easiest thing on their body to get the best amount, to get the best return. Because otherwise, this is where sort of like people's training egos need to sort of get into check. But it's the training is the training of like people actually. It's more about what they can actually sort of put up on social media as to what they are doing. It's more about sort of stroking their training ego as opposed to the results that they're trying to get from it. So I think that you have to remain objective, and you have to just make sure that you're always getting as much as you can from as little work as possible, because then that's going to allow you to make that sort of that progression. And it's, we've spoken before about skipping steps. It stops you from doing that, because if you do skip steps at any point in your development, sometimes it takes a long time to sort of rework that. So don't jump onto Smolov. it's not going to work out.
But can you do a Smolov cycle like just outside of class times? Is that going to work? Just like, what about a baby Smolov?
Smolov Junior?
Yeah, Smolov Junior. Smolov Senior. I know a lot of people that have started but have just not finished that program.
It's very brutal. For people who don't know, Smolov is if you start searching around for squat programs on the internet, you're almost certainly going to come across it. It's an extremely high volume, powerlifting focused squat program that is pretty brutal and has some pretty aggressive percentages for folks. And yeah, it's not necessarily something that you're going to be able to just tack on to some CrossFit classes and have a good experience with.
If I remember rightly, was it written for Bulgarian weightlifters back in like the 70s or something? Was that when it was?
Maybe I'm wrong on that. I thought it was a powerlifting focused program, but I am potentially incorrect on that.
I think it's powerlifting, because Bulgarians would just max out. It would just be it would be their post lunch lift would be they'd finish their cigarette and then they would go in the gym. They'll max out, and then they would go and take a nap and another cigarette, and they would go and max out their power snatch.
Which is cool.
I know. It's like it's sort of almost like I think John Bros, the American weightlifting coach, I think he sort of, I'm not too sure if he uses the Bulgarian method, but I know that he likes it. But I think what he said, he likened it to someone who was just sort of working manual labor. Like the day they finish their first day, they're pretty beat up, so they just take some painkillers. They have a hot bath, And then day after day, they just get used to it. And I was like, yes, I'm not 100% sure lifting up bricks and carrying things has the same effect as maxing out a clean and jerk every single day. But yeah.
I mean, all of these programs were also written for people who were using various supplements to, like,
they're on a plant-based diet.
Oh yeah, I mean plant-based, obviously, but
yeah, they were taking some glycine.
I heard
they're taking glycine and glutamine.
I heard creatine as well. Like, I don't know if that's true. I don't want to call anyone out for it, but I heard creatine was used.
Yeah, they had a special slurry of glycine, glutamine, and creatine. Delightful. Well, yeah, in terms of actual very tangible takeaways, I think that if we were to make a specific recommendation, which is tough because everyone potentially wants to work on something different, whether that's conditioning or skills or strength or some combination of those in a CrossFit setting, that what needs to be done is you need to actually map out how many times per week you're going to be doing accessory work. And then ideally, right, let's say you have 4 sessions, at least 2 of those sessions would be dedicated to what your priority is. If that's conditioning, if that's upper body pushing strength, if that's, gymnastics repeatability. And then whatever the 3rd session is, then you can focus that on touches on a lot of the other things that you want to maintain without the expectation of really improving them, right? So if you have 1 or 2 clear priorities, structure 2 of your accessory sessions to focus on those, and then have the other session be focused on whatever else you're working on. And by prioritizing like that, it's not necessarily going to be the classic block periodization of drop everything and only focus on this one thing, which we already discussed doesn't work terribly well, but it is going to have you allocate more of your training time and more of your training adaptation reserve to the things that you want to focus on. And then ideally, by touching on that in addition to the general CrossFit that you're probably already doing in classes, and potentially some additional work in the ancillary sessions or whatever, the group decides that you're going to do, that ideally you're then able to actually integrate. Let's say you do get stronger on your squat clean, or you do get better at, barbell repeatability, that actually becomes something that is a utilizable skill for you in a CrossFit context, rather than just being something, that you kind of got better at on your own, but didn't actually, see that translate into any improved sport performance. Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.